And let me turn on my the recorder on my phone just in case for backup. Okay.
All right. So, for a bit of context, we were just talking about our mutual experiences of coronavirus, and in particular, the kind of the, how would I say it, the somewhat, ranging from somewhat to completely or absurdly inelegant regulations, both formal and normative, in the context of COVID. And what just came into my mind because of the context of our conversation was, okay, so I'm going to throw a couple of things on the table. One is going to be something like this notion of complicatedness, and another one of complexity.
Mm-hmm.
And then I'm going to use another concept. I'm just more or less defining a term. This is a word that has meaning, but I'm going to use it specifically. So coordination, and then the other one's going to be coherence.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And the visual image maybe is a little bit like Minecraft. You know how Minecraft has this 8-bit aesthetic of blockiness?
Mm-hmm.
And on the other side of that disjunction might be reality, which has this sort of fluid connectedness and continuity and fine-grainedness all the way down to the Planck limit.
Mm-hmm.
And by the way, past the Planck limit for those of us who spend time on the other side of quantum mechanics. And I think those two all fit together. And what we're experiencing, or one of the things that we're experiencing, is the incapacity, the inelegant, well, actually, the inelegant capacity is probably the better way of describing it, the inelegant capacity of complicated systems using coordination methodologies to try to respond to complexity.
Mm-hmm.
So the image I have is like, have you ever seen like one of those, like a robot that's kind of herky-jerky,
Mm-hmm.
trying to grab an egg, and it's like, and it just breaks the egg. But a human can reach out and grab the egg, in fact, can juggle them, and we're okay. Endeavoring to try to figure out how to puppet master, like, think of a marionette, trying to get a puppet using coordination structures and complicated control systems, which is to say our regulatory governance mechanisms and the social environment that is prodded from the outside by those exteriors. How should I behave? Well, let me give you a list of things. Let me as a regulator and a media personality give you a list of things that you should be doing. So governing your normative choices from the outside. What that does is it reduces the elegance of our choice making, the elegance of our movement through reality, to something like that robot. So it's very herky-jerky.
Mm-hmm.
So as you say, like you get put into the airplane and everybody's wearing masks, but you're packed in like sardines. And then when you land the airplane, the rule is now we're going to social distance as you walk out. So suddenly you're going to move from being 3 inches from each other to being 1.5 meters from each other. But you can all take off your masks as soon as you get out of the airplane, whatever, right? Some set of rule structures. And the point is that that's just how trying to navigate complexity using rule structures works. And, if I've got a space, Leibniz, we're talking to Germans, let's invoke Leibniz. Because all of this comes down to Leibniz, by the way. Because the notion of the integration, the integration curve. Remember, he was dealing in calculus. He was dealing with the problem of that. How do you actually measure a curve? And his insight was, okay, what I'm going to do is this, and it's like a sleight of hand move. From a practical purpose, as an engineer, totally legitimate. What I'm going to do is I'm going to make a bunch of squares, rectangles, and then notice that I've kind of got close. I've got a bunch of space I haven't filled, right, where the rectangle doesn't match the actual curvature of the curve. But I'm going to make next move is I'll make more rectangles. I'll go from 4 rectangles to 8, 8 to 16. So my error gets smaller and smaller and smaller, right? And then Leibniz goes, all right, here's the move. You ready? The limit as x approaches infinity. So I'm not going to imagine that I've got a nearly infinite number of rectangles. And so therefore my error vectors towards 0, right? So what I'm doing there is I'm trying to take a complicated a coordinated structure and map it to an analog, a complex, a coherent structure, or coherent system. And there's utility to that. This is, it renders it available. If I like the Leibnizian move there, allows me to move or to apply complicated structures to control, in this case, say to engineer complex environments. But here's the problem. The limit as x approaches infinity is not the same thing as infinity. Right? Those are not the same. And it's not like in some sense, it's not even infinitesimally close. He actually invents this term, the infinitesimal. From the point of view of the finite, it is infinitesimally close. From the point of view of the infinite, it is infinitely not. And that's like, I think we have this really interesting practical experience. Like there's a way, and now I'm kind of getting to the point of why I'm bringing this up here. There's a way, which I think I call coherence. I think you also call it coherence, or maybe use a German word for it. But the notion is that mode of being in relationship that is in some sense coming from the infinite, or complexity, sitting in complexity, in connection with, in continuity with complexity, which is to say in continuity with the whole, that is well suited to navigating complexity, and doesn't have this characteristic of herky-jerky inelegance in relationship to what's actually unfolding. Rather, it has a characteristic of elegance. And so the net answer to the question that you asked before we started recording, my experience of COVID has been that, of just constantly being confronted by the somewhat ludicrous and somewhat irritating inelegance of our current manic effort to engage in a Leibnizian mapping, which allows us to control through complicated regulatory structures an actually deeply complex event. There you go.
Yeah. Cool. And we'll start at another point and see where that loops back in and so forth. I mean, it's fascinating because the disjuncture between the complicated attempting to meet and through coordination organize the complex creates a dissonance in us. Now, it seems to create a dissonance in people for whom it's all too complicated. It's just all too complicated, and it is all too complex. But there's a rub there, and it's like this is something that's attempted. They feel the imposition, and then on the other end, someone like yourself who's like, wow, we're trying to control something that we have absolutely no control over, and that is part of an organic responsive system that we have created. That is actually that we can't easily, it's not fixable. There's not a fix here.
Well, and in fact, you put a very important point out there, which is that we created. And here's the thing. I think this is the part where, in some sense, we need to start being serious about this. So, we do this move, right? When we do this move, one of the things two things happen simultaneously. One thing is we get control over whatever it is we're trying to control.
So we think.
Well, we do, but at a cost.
Yeah. Okay.
We create more havoc at the same time.
Yeah.
Right. And the havoc is sort of outside of it, and the control's inside of it. And also, the havoc is both outside and inside in the micro, but in the meso, in the middle, we get this node of control. So think of like an agricultural field. I boundary the natural prairie. I plant rows of plants. I irrigate it. So there's this space in the middle that I control, and I can in fact optimize. That's the point. I can optimize and I can maximize the yield. down at the micro level, I'm destroying the fertility of the soil. I'm destroying the biome. I'm creating monoculture, which means in the interior of the immune system, like all these things at the micro level, I'm pushing out havoc. And at the macro level, like the ecosystem of the birds that are flying and the bees that are pollinating and the other plants that are growing, I'm generating havoc in the macro, right? So in the macro and the micro, I'm generating havoc. In the middle, I'm creating
Order.
optimized control.
Yeah.
Exactly. Now, I can do that. And for a while, I can be okay doing that. In fact, for a short period of time, relatively short, maybe minutes, it may be 1,000 years, but in the context of the universe, short. It even may feel like it's working well. I can kind of ignore the micro, ignore the macro, and in the meso, I'm getting the thing I'm looking for. And kind of like, that's okay. That's one of the things that we do. Everything does it. Everything kind of has to make that trade-off. But the chicken will come home to roost, or whatever the right roosting is.
Or the bat.
Hell will come to be paid. Yeah, the bat will come home to roost, or the pine beetle, the pestilence. So then, at a certain point in the middle, short-term, long-term, as the short-term begins to seed into the long-term, the havoc comes back, and now I'm oh no, what do I do? Well, historically, what we do is we double down. We bound that. I'm going to bound the havoc. I'm going to now try to take more control over the larger system, right? And so what happens is I get another bite at the apple. I now take a deep breath. Oh gosh, I've solved this problem for a short time, but at the cost of even more havoc, pushed even more deeply into the micro and the macro. Okay, so let's make this concrete. Why did coronavirus happen? Well, one of the reasons why coronavirus happened is because we have created a gigantic global meshwork of people in different environments that are connected continuously through mass transportation. So you've created this sort of an absolutely perfect petri dish for microbes to experiment with different possibilities of becoming virulent, and then to spread once they've discovered it. Right? So, and by the way, spread instantly, effectively, like in a period of months as opposed to a period of decades. Okay, well, as you say, we created that. Well, why did we create that? We created that because we didn't think about that problem, that havoc happening at the micro and the macro, right? The macro being the whole world, and the micro being the viruses, that was happening as a consequence of our control structure, an economy that was trying to optimize for, how fun it is to be able to visit Beijing in an airplane, and how efficient it is to be able to ship shoes from China to Germany. Okay, so what happens? Well, we get coronavirus. So what do? We double down. We're going to create a vaccine. We're going to make everybody wear masks. Like, with the control structure still hasn't woken up to the fact that it's the thing that's creating the problem in the first place. And every time we double down, the magnitude of the consequences of the havoc that we're generating gets bigger. Right? So if you thought coronavirus was big, which by the way, it has been, I mean, at the level of epidemiology, at the level of medicine, relatively micro, at the level of economics and politics, world historical. Never before in human history has an event of this kind occurred in both magnitude and scope. But if you think that's a big deal, wait until you see what's waiting for us on the other side of the havoc we're just getting ready to create, and once again endeavoring to control the thing that's happening now, right? Complexity keeps trying to break through and bring this thing back bring the complicated back into complexity, and we keep trying to grab it and hold it in complicatedness. And the worst part is we will inevitably fail. Right? The infinite, by definition, comes to an end. The finite, by definition, comes to an end. And bizarrely enough, not only will we inevitably fail, but an increasingly large number of distinct scientific methods keep pointing to more or less the same point in time, which is like the next 10 to 15 years. The curve keeps going to infinity. There's a hyperbolic crossover point to an actual infinity. So it seems increasingly likely that we will actually fail soon. And if not soon, relatively soon, like in the next century. So, all right, so that's that.
So part of what you're saying is or implicit in what, yeah, implicit in what you're saying is that there is a mode of engagement with life, or mode of being in life, that we are using to, you could say, create order and meaning,
Mm.
that is uh, that is based on certain presumptions and assumptions, um, and that is no longer working.
I want to. There's a word there. You added meaning, and I think it's really interesting. So maybe a little bit later we'll deal with it. But I'd actually like to, for at least for a moment, I'd like to append simulated in front of that. So to create order and to simulate meaning.
Okay, good. Yeah, that's
Please
nice.
continue.
That's nice. Because we're part of what you're saying is that in the examples that you've just given, is that the crisis is not the thing of COVID or even climate change, in a sense.
Right.
We're all aware that we're encountering multiple crises, and that COVID is making it worse. You know, the economy, which was massively unequal and not working for the vast majority of humans on this planet, humans, other species, etc.
Yeah.
It's now this one is going to, the coronavirus, and the attempt to respond to it with control is going to make that even worse. It's very likely, if not already happened, actually. So it's not these various crises: the economic crisis, the climate crisis, the wealth gap, poverty. It's not any of these things in particular. It's something else, which
Right.
which you and or others call a meaning crisis. And
Vervaeke calls it a meaning crisis.
yeah, John Vervaeke calls it a meaning crisis. I think, and which is pointing to something that is inherent in our responses to all of these different things. Or there's some
Yes.
way in which the way that we know how to engage with life, with the world, with each other, is creating crises that we're helpless to know how to respond to.
Yep.
Yeah. So can you, if you were to point to what is the meaning crisis made of? What is it that is failing now? How would you describe that?
Okay. So it's made up of a devil's bargain. So we have a devil's bargain, and maybe I even kind of want to double click in the context of a highly secular phase of life. Double click on the fact that I just invoked a character that is not typically known as secular.
Yeah.
And I think there's something really meaningful to that. So here's the bargain. Funny. It is straight up the devil's bargain. I'm going to teach you a new kind of game. I'm the devil in this story. I'm going to teach you a new kind of game. And in this new kind of game, I'm going to give you 2 gifts in exchange for 1 prize. One gift is the gift of avarice. All those things which you can name, you may have in plenty. Piles of treasure. You become mammon. Right? You get the gift of mammon's desire, but you have to be able to name it. All those things which you can name, you can have in plenty. The second gift is the gift of war. You can protect those things that you have from anyone. and in fact can take them from anyone you desire. You can win in any conflict. That's the nature of the game that I'm going to teach you how to play.
Mm.
All you have to give me is your immortal soul.
Yeah.
Which, by the way, never really existed in the first place. Now, what do I mean by that? What do I mean by your immortal soul? What I mean is your actual connectedness to the whole of life.
Mm.
What I mean is the distinction between simulations of meaning and meaningfulness itself.
Mm.
What I mean is the long term, simply put. Right? The continuity between the micro, the meso, and the macro. Wholeness, being part of the whole rather than being separate from the whole by carving things out. And that's what I mean. That's what the meaning of that devil's bargain is. Now, there's an actual context of this devil's bargain. There's a context where it may have been a trade that was a good trade. Mm-hmm. If you don't take the trade and your neighbor does take the trade, then you're the one who goes away. Mm-hmm. Your neighbor takes your stuff. Mm-hmm. If you don't take the trade and nature itself has become too harsh, then you go away. Mm-hmm. So oftentimes, and in fact, historically speaking, the bargain has been a cruel choice. Mm-hmm. To fail to take the choice was actually to choose simply death. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Through one road or another road, or enslavement, which is death by another name. Mm-hmm. But it's a devil's bargain. You really are just delaying the inevitable. Mm-hmm. And expanding the consequence of the inevitable. So you may have lived in a place that was becoming desert. Mm-hmm. And by virtue of playing this new game, you are for a while converting your place into something that is a garden. Mm-hmm. But again, at two costs. Mm-hmm. At the cost of your neighbor and at the cost of your future. That I would say is the absolute central essence of it.
Hmm. Wow, that hits. Because I think when you look out at the kind of the fragmented and warring social context that we're in at the moment, I think people are motivated by the feeling that they don't have a future and that they've already lost. And this is in the terms of the devil's bargain, that they have not been able to win and that they have no future in it. Ironically, because it kind of turns around on itself.
That's the devil's bargain.
Yeah.
The thing in the story, the moral lesson is that when you enter the devil's bargain, at the end of the day, the only one who wins is the devil.
Oh, right.
But you feel like you're winning.
Yeah.
Until you'll lose.
Right.
And then you suddenly wake up to like, oh my gosh, what did I do? But it's too late. And we have all kinds of examples of this that are very practical. Cocaine. Yeah. Right? Any addiction. All addiction. Yeah. Yeah. Is of that type. Mm-hmm. And the devil's bargain is an addiction. Mm-hmm. Right? That's the point of it. And you have, and like addictions, it has the characteristic of doubling down and becoming increasingly trapped by it, becoming increasingly manic around needing to get your fix, which is just to get another hit of control.
I'm also struck by how far back this goes in history, the way that you framed it. Mm-hmm. Because you have the maybe first 100,000 years of human Homo sapiens living and whatever in what looks like, from more recent data and interpretation, a fairly peaceable kingdoms, or because they were so far apart. Mm-hmm. They were small settlements, far apart, no resource crunch.
Relatively low density, relatively large distance.
Yeah.
In fact, and almost always significant territory that is hard but available.
Yeah. If you there is some, it's not like, whoo, I can just like sit back and eat mangoes.
Right. People did not become Eskimos because they like to ski.
Right.
Once they figured out how to Eskimo, it's a perfectly valid human niche.
Right. Right. But many of the niches were difficult but workable.
Yep.
But then when the desertification in Africa and so forth, that then it's like we don't have anything. We can't live here any longer. We can't.
Yep.
There's no place to go. But they still have stuff, so we're getting it.
Yeah.
But that. I mean, it's interesting because you've actually gone to the root of something that is really the beginning of what we call civilization.
Yep. I completely, that is my premise. That is the proposition that I will make. And there's an event that I don't think is widely known, and it would be better if it were.
Mm.
It was discovered in genetics.
Mm.
And I'm pretty sure it happens at the Neolithic transition, which is to say right now in the context of like the event, the moment we're talking about. And it has to do with a truly catastrophic collapse in the diversity of the Y chromosome.
Mm.
Something like 90% of Y chromosomal lineages went extinct in humans. What happened? A big fucking war.
Oh.
Now, it may not have been a war of slaughter, but it was definitely a war of reproduction, meaning 90% of males failed to reproduce, which is to say that there was X number of Y chromosomes, and it became 0.1X. There was a bottleneck, a massive bottleneck. I think it's called the Neolithic Bottleneck. And it happened at exactly this time, right? So there's this, the context of this moment of desertification and the moment of, sorry, what's it called when you run out of water?
Well, arid. What is it?
Thirst, right? Lack of water.
Right.
The context, by the way, of also just reproduction, population increase,
Mm.
and the filling of the niches,
Mm.
the lack of other places to go, was enormous.
Mm.
Right? 90% of male lineages went extinct.
Wow.
The devil's bargain was no small thing. Right? The devil's bargain was not like a minor shift; it was a major shift. And one of the primary explanations, because we don't really know what happened, we don't have any archaeological evidence, we only have this genetic evidence and some like mythopoetic stories. But one of the major theories, and I think this is a lot to it, is for example the emergence of polygamous hierarchies. If
Hierarchies. Okay.
if the king has 1,000 wives in his harem, 999 other men don't have a female partner. Well, how did that happen? Well, that happened because the king made the devil's bargain.
Mm.
I have as much of what I want as I want, which is in this case women. And I get to take. I can protect it from others and take it from others. And that's the bargain. Well, the bargain has materiality to it. There's 999 other men who don't have women. I'm going to make a deal with them. The 10 of you who are the toughest, meanest, hardest now get to become warriors. And you get to have a female partner. In exchange, you beat the crap out of the other 900, right? There's a whole technology of domination and control that was developed and of course perfected. The Sumerians were pretty good at it, but eventually the Akkadians who were on the border were like, man, fuck you guys. I'm going to learn all your stuff. And now we're going to figure out how to take you over. And then, and it kind of moves back and forth. You kind of just watch history. The history of the Roman Empire is very much like it's close enough that we can look at it very closely. And there's this, a moment of like nuclear fusion where the techniques of the devil's bargain on the hills of Rome, in the context of almost being overrun by the Celts. The Celts are this massive pressure on not the Celts, what the hell were they? The Etruscans, this massive pressure on the Romans. The Romans make it, they figure out a new way of playing this game that the devil has given us and begin to expand. right? And they keep running into barriers. They're running into the Carthaginians, and the Punic Wars happen, but they win, right? They conquer the Carthaginians, and they expand, and they expand, and they expand, and they expand, and they create this expanding sphere. Actually, in a moment, remind me about Peter Turchin and Carol Quigley and Tyson Yunkaporta.
Okay.
But then their expansion comes to an end, right? The energy of the thing that they're able to harness can only go so far, right? You literally have a line, a wall, Hadrian's Wall in England. But the Germans are on the outside of that sphere, and they suffered, right? They suffered from the Romans pushing them out of their land and capturing their kings, and taking them around in dog collars. But they learned, right? They learned how to play the game. Right? Their mythologies shift. Frey and Freya drift to the side, and Wotan and Thor drift to the fore. We become a more warlike, militaristic steel. We steal techniques of organization. We steal techniques of making weapons. We culturally appropriate. Until two things happen. The interior of the Roman sphere of domination and control has become fragile at the micro level. Slaves are becoming, farms are now almost entirely run by slaves, and only a small number of elites control the entirety of Rome. There are no more sort of free yeoman members of the legions. The legions themselves are now run by mercenaries paid with money. Right? It becomes fragile in the inside, and the exterior becomes is now better at playing the devil's game. And so the Romans, they lose. Right? You eventually will always lose. This is a game where the end is always lose. And now the Germans move in, whoosh, and a new move happens, and the ratchet moves up. Right? A new level has been discovered in this game. And we just have a series, ratcheting up, and each iteration is this extremely intense, because losing is on the other side of the equation. Not just death, but like extinguishment, rape and pillage, and destruction. And so, of course, the stakes are high. And so the intensity and the willing to make trade-offs, the willing to trade off the long term for the short term, they're willing to build nuclear weapons, which may be the end of humanity, but we need to win this fight now, right? Pushes innovation forward, pushes that game forward and forward and forward. And then we are where we are. So now I've done two things. One is I've sort of told a story about the moment, like the beginning, and the re-beginning, like how that moment is rediscovered over and over and over again, and also the story of the progression, like how it actually has moved. Like the story of history is just the story of the playing out of the logic of this particular bargain in the context of the world, both its boundaries and its specifics, and then of course the end point. Right? We're now at the nadir of this game. There are no worlds to conquer,
right?
No niches to fill.
Okay, I was going to say, where are we now, and why is why has this come to crisis in the way that it has? Why is it that people are, how is it that the game in some ways has what is it called? The lose-lose nature of the game is now becoming apparent.
Well, there's actually a fundamental answer, but I'm not sure if I'm capable of articulating it either accurately or clearly, but I'll see if I can try. I'll try the less fundamental version first. In mathematics, there's a particular kind of, or computer science, a particular kind of object called a space-filling algorithm. Right? It's essentially like, what's the most efficient way to search and fill a space? Notice though that the end point of that is the space is filled. You might say that the game we've been playing has been a space-filling algorithm. And a very simple way of putting it is that the space is filled. The beginning of the game,
there's a lot
happened when the previous version of humanness had filled the world. Right, all the niches were filled, or at least enough of the niches were filled that it was requisite in certain locations to figure out how to do something entirely new. we've kind of reached that, or we're reaching that. But there's another more important, more fundamental. And for here, what I would do is I would actually point to a book by Jeffrey West called Scale. And a part of that book that is, how would I say it? It's almost like esoteric. It's not the main point of the book, and it's kind of stuck into the last third. So if you're a tourist, you may not even get there. You like read the first half, have coffee table conversation, and move on. But if you get to the last third, he talks about the fact that there is a very interesting regular mathematical consequence of each reset, each iteration on the game. And that's that the period of duration is cut in half, more or less. It's shortened. So, my first move, say the Egyptian Empire, lasts for thousands of years. But each major move lasts less time. And we actually see this. We can actually see these happening in more narrow and therefore more tractable phenomena. We can actually see these S curves where each, an S curve is a moment of exploration, discovery of how to do a complicated control system, extracting the maximum value of it, and then reaching the space filling. We've reached the edges of its value, and then in fact collapse. So that's an S curve is a in technology in particular, is a description of these kinds of things. And what we see is I can do a reset. I can try to change the basis. I can try to go from Greece to Rome, and from Rome to the Holy Roman Empire, to the Germanic version. But at the cost of the next iteration burns itself out faster. And by the way, I think there's a very specific reason for that, which I can go to if you'd like. But the point is that, and I'm doing a bit of a ham-handed job of describing it. But if you look at Jeffrey's book, it's right there in plain English, and also plain math or curves. And this again is one of the points, is that as it turns out, if you take a look at the curves that we have, and you take a look at the rate of decay, the period shrinking, you get to a point where you have to reset faster and faster. And then you get to a point where you have to reset effectively instantaneously. So it's almost as if the game itself had a built-in terminus point based upon just that characteristic.
But it's I don't know if this will make sense. It's exactly like Leibniz.
Yes.
It's exactly like Leibniz, and actually it's the difference between, and this is where maybe perhaps something esoteric, if you will, comes in, the difference between the finite that is simulating the infinite and the infinite itself. That in that there's a we're missing a deeper engagement with the real, if you want to put it that way, or with a dimension of reality that is beyond that which we have created in the game that we're playing.
And something about the nature of that missing, in some sense, as it turns out, has a clock that strikes 12 around now. Meaning that it bizarrely enough, whether you do it from the bottom up or the top down. So the top down version is, every iteration, the amount of years in between becomes shorter, and that reaches to 2045 or so. The bottoms up is, how many resources do we actually have to, what's the total niche potential, and how much niche potential have we got left? Right? As it turns out, those both sort of like cross over. They close in the same point. My bigger point is that it's almost like as it turns out. Just as it turns out, this particular finite actually does reach its crossover point. It reaches its point where you begin to notice that you're actually not doing the infinite thing right about now. Right about now. Well, maybe a few minutes ago.
Yeah, right. Or tomorrow at 3.
Yeah, tea time.
um, okay. So is this what you mean by game A?
Yes.
Okay. So you speak about game A as the game that civilization basically has been playing, or that humans have been playing in concert, you could say, together for the past 10,000 years or so. How many?
35.
35. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
But it's not an S curve. So for the first like 15, 20 of those, it's not really noticeable. It's like
Yeah.
small fits and
Yeah.
starts, and things
Yeah.
pop and fall. And then, around 10,000 years, we're like, yeah, we're definitely in it.
And the human experience of that now in Western culture is one of deep dislocation.
Yeah, yeah. Well, let me do a bit of so the word meaning,
Mm-hmm.
simulated meaning, and meaningfulness.
Mm-hmm.
It's well, for many people, it's easier to look at the problem at the level of the objective. So we see climate change,
Mm-hmm.
the soil degradation. We see
Mm-hmm.
water pollution or loss of water. But the interior is equally strip mined.
Mm-hmm.
The interior
Right.
is equally desertified.
Right.
And the interior here is the interior of all possible interiors.
Uh-huh.
So the relationships between and among people, what I might call community.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just going to, again, so I'll just define the term. It's nice that we have potentially a language barrier. So we're absolutely certainly not able to communicate using words. We can just use words and define them. So I will define community to mean real relationships, authentic, rich, complex relationships among, in this case, people. And by the way, as it turns out, also nature, but we don't have to worry about that just yet. And then I'm going to define this other term. I'm just going to society.
Mm-hmm.
And society is formal. Society is mediated by complicated. So when my mom makes me dinner, that is a communal relationship.
Mm-hmm.
When McDonald's gives me dinner, that is a social relationship.
Mm-hmm.
In both cases, I get dinner, but there's a very different context. And society, most fundamentally, is a parasite on community. Its most fundamental essence is that it just consumes the meaningfulness in the relationships of community.
It fabricates and simulates that which is meaningful and integrous in community.
Exactly. And so what it does is there has to be something real, a real relationship, or something that is in the relationship of community, and then society intermediates that.
Mm-hmm.
It gets in between, and then it fabricates, it simulates it. It says,
Mm-hmm.
oh, you're still getting dinner.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, it's more efficient,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's this trick, right? It's the devil's bargain once again.
Mm-hmm.
You get as much as you like. You can get more than you could get before. You have growth. You have more mammon, right? The deal of mammon. And by the way, in the case of most, the contemporary version of society, money is the primary mechanism.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you have money, right, then you can take the food from other people. Right? You're the one you get to keep it. Right?
Mm-hmm.
So society, right, that dynamic, the relationship between society as defined herein and community as defined herein is this relationship of the corrosion, the corruption, the degradation, the strip mining, the extraction of the interior of human relationships.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And of course, exactly the same thing is happening in the interior of a distinct individual.
Mm-hmm.
You might call that identity.
Mm-hmm.
Self and identity.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Self is like community in our analogy. And it's like nature in the bigger context.
Mm-hmm.
And identity is like society.
Mm-hmm.
Identity is a parasite. Identity exists by virtue of intermediating relationships in the interior of self and simulating them and extracting them and making them more salient, more speakable, more controllable, but at the cost of generating havoc in both the micro and the macro. And so the same dynamic happens at all these different levels. And by the way, are mutually reinforcing. Society wants identity. Society can interface with identity very well. Society doesn't like selves. Society in selves is much more problematic. Self recoils at society. Identity plays the society game. So there's a sort of a conspiracy between the intrinsic dynamics of all of these different characteristics, which is why the process unfolds in the way that it unfolds.
And by identity, you're speaking about a certain thing or certain way, a certain psychology in terms of identity, a group, a kind of often a kind of flattened out form of
Let's just do it.
Complexity.
Let's just use our friend Leibniz again.
Yeah.
But now let's replace math with words. If it can be said, if a finite string of signifiers can be used to define, that is identity. It's the finitization of the infinite self in the context of, for example, speaking it, naming it, labeling it, describing it. And it's very linguistic, right? That whole notion of like the monkey mind or the chattering brain. That's an identity creator, and it's also an identity maintainer.
And so it's interesting because it's not individuation.
No, it's not individuation.
And in some ways, within a culture that is supposed to prize the individual, again, the individual identity is the devil's bargain by which one falsely individuates.
Yes, very much so, and which is why it's so adolescent, right? Why the adolescent break happens is because precisely that, right? We, instead of individuating, we develop an identity, which is like massively non-functional, and both felt as non-functional and practically non-functional. Updating and modifying your identity is a herky-jerky process. It's like our coronavirus metaphor.
Right.
So yes, exactly to the point.
Yeah. And so because society is offering identity but not individuation, truly, actually, we are ill-fitting.
Yes.
Our humanity doesn't fit into our identities, and if your identity is one that is disparaged in the dominant culture or in society, then you're angry and resentful,
or not. But so let's double click on that, because there's a very powerful point there. Very powerful point. Anger and resentment is quite likely and quite common. However, it also can give way to a deeper level of wisdom and insight. Because one of the things that you're afforded is that it's the reality of the mismatch between identity and self is perhaps a little bit more obvious. This is
you have an angle on the dynamics in society that create this. You have an angle in, or potentially have an angle in.
Yes, this notion of the minor language that Kafka and Gigi always talk about, or the notion of the outsider.
Yes.
If with Kafka, right? In Germany, just he's like looking around, going, "This is fucked up."
Yeah.
And it's obviously fucked up because it keeps kicking me in the balls, right? So it's easy for me to notice that it's fucked up, and then I can kind of just sort of be. It's not. I mean, it is a choice, but at the end of the day, it's a challenging choice. Okay, it's fucked up, and now what? And in Kafka's case, it was like, okay, well, can I find some way to be able to highlight that and navigate through it without becoming angry and resentful? But in many cases, you do in fact just become angry and resentful and throw the rock through the window.
Right. I think there's also another element. Angry and resentful can be a motivating and moving force, as you're saying.
Back to our Germans in the Roman context.
Absolutely. But when we bring in humiliation, because that's also often a part of it, that humiliation and shame often lead to something quite different.
Wow, that's powerful. Well, it's interesting because so the word humiliate and shame is, I'm going to hold that apart for a second. So humiliation, think about it. Think about the term, meaning of the term, right?
Yeah.
To become humble, to be humbled, right? If you are humiliated before the infinite, you release your identity into your true self.
Right. Right.
But in the context of society, to be humiliated is to actually have yourself bound to your identity and then degraded.
Yes.
Right? Which is a big part of the nature of society. Right? A big part of the nature of the devil's bargain is crucial to recognize. Right? A big part of the nature of the devil's bargain is precisely the requisite degradation of the other. Right? For me to, at the end of the day, for me to win the game of war, there must be someone who loses the game of war. And that someone who loses the game of war must be humiliated. They must be trodden upon. Otherwise, I didn't win. Like the winning and losing, if there's no loser, there's no winner.
Well, and also you need to make sure that they lose, and can't get back up again because you don't want to deal with them again. Yeah.
Well, double whammy, because if they're angry and resentful, which they probably are, they're going to fuck me up, because I remember I used to be a German being degraded by the Romans. So once I fuck the Romans up, I'm looking around, right? Who's coming next?
Right.
We know how this game works. As soon as you let down your guard, somebody's going to come, right? And they're going to come and they're going to be smarter and faster and more cunning and more cruel because they were learning in the crucible of having shit handed to them, right? And we've seen this happen, gosh, several thousand times, maybe several hundreds of thousands of times, but certainly several thousand times. So it's not lost on the winner that the losers are only losers of the moment. And if you have not sown the fields with salt, they are waiting for their moment to seize the throne.
Right.
Yes, precisely.
Yeah. So actually, you're giving me I have this felt sense of the world, and this kind of grid being, this grid that is trying to be enforced on it.
This grid, exactly. Yeah.
Through the systems of control at this, as you said, at this meso level. It's trying to like bind the earth, the living force of it, the human messiness of it, etc. in this way. And there's all this stuff squishing out everywhere.
Everywhere. Yep.
And the squishing out part is the politics in the United States. It's the rise of the right again in Germany. It's climate change. It's the bat in a market in Wuhan. That it's all of this stuff that is like this doesn't fit, and you are trying to make me fit into something that I can see somehow is either humiliating to me or life denying.
Yep.
Which can be the same thing, but often it's a different reaction, or things that people are reacting to differently. Some would love to play the game, perhaps, or their anger is that they're not able to be in the game. But many more and more are saying, but the game is really screwed up.
Yeah, it's something a little bit along the lines of like, if the only choice that you see is a choice between depression and SSRIs, then give me SSRIs. And if the supply of SSRIs is that 10 of us get them and 100 don't, then we're going to have a very straightforward game. And it's a little bit like that. And I really like the way that you brought up humiliation and shame in that fashion, because that double valence, that bivalence, that at the end of the day, humiliation, when matched to community and self and whole and world, is a virtue. To be humble is a very powerful thing. And of course, if we're playing the devil's game, we have to be very mindful of the fact that all virtues must be turned on their head. So humiliation must first and foremost be made profane, and then repeated over and over again in its profane form, so we lose track of its sacred form. Right. And I also like. Oh, sorry, please.
I say that's real. That feels very, very important, and it's also it also serves at this point in culture to create a kind of allergy around the degree of surrender that one needs in order to be able to truly allow the infinite to be what it is and to be who we are in relationship to it.
Oh yeah, I mean that allergy is powerful, isn't it? Even like the word infinite. We have a huge portion of the Western population who has an allergic reaction to even the notion of the infinite.
Yeah.
And all other kinds of things, even like consciousness, certainly the soul.
Yeah.
And you know, for example, John Vervaeke and I have just found ourselves in this really interesting practice of resacralizing just a whole bunch of terms, like the word sacred, and faith, right? And noticing. In fact, I was talking to somebody in Los Angeles a couple of days ago, and I said, my current operating heuristic is the more a particular concept is just covered in piles of stinking shit, the more likely it's the place where good stuff is to be found. I am now becoming a professional shit diver because my operating heuristic
looking for the pearls.
because they've been hidden.
Yeah.
Right? It is precisely that which is sacred must be made profane until we've lost track of it, right? And until we become allergic to it and we now avoid it without even having to be managed. We don't even have to be controlled. We avoid the sacred because we've identified it as, in fact, as allergic.
But the cost to our capacity to have integrity, meaning integrated into wholeness, the cost of that is I mean, well, that's the devil's bargain, right?
That's the devil's bargain. Yeah.
We're not, you don't get that. You play this game and you don't.
That's your soul, right?
Yeah, and you could feel that in this. Yeah.
Yeah, that's exactly it, right? When you made the bargain and you sold your soul to the devil, the cost was integrity. The cost was integrousness, to have a well-integrated whole. And of course, I think we mentioned this earlier, at the end of the day, there is in fact only one well-integrated whole, right?
Yeah.
Precisely to the degree to which your interior, as your individualness, begins to become a well-integrated whole, it becomes participating in a well-integrated whole of community, which is itself part of a well-integrated whole of nature, which is itself a part of a well-integrated whole of, call it, universe. So the process works, the profanity, the profaning of it and the extraction of it happens at all these levels. So does the integration of it happen at all these levels. So we are separated from ourselves. We are separated from other people. We are separated from nature. We're separated from the universe, or from the world, however you'd like to say it. All as a result of the same bargain.
Yeah. And so, and I can now, I mean, I know that part of where you see us needing to go has to do with, I can't remember quite how you call it, distributive cognition.
Yeah.
And I can see how this deep sharedness and this kind of deep investment in communities, plural, and the conscious linking of them, that has an antidotal, not an anecdotal, but an antidote quality to what it is that we're speaking about, this source of the meaning crisis.
Yes. The thing that came there was a distinction that I learned in the context of my friends from the integral community, which is not historically been my community. I suppose I have a lot of friends from that community, so maybe it is now. The distinction between, or you even use the term like autonomy and communion. The gift, the thing that we are moving into, is this gift where community is not only no longer, or is not only not antithetical to our individuation, but is in fact generative of it and generated by it. Right? So it is the communion of communion with individuation. It is the dynamic, the realization that there is a particular location, particular kind of community. So it's not all communities, but a particular kind of community that constitutes, in many ways, its essence is that it constitutes whole, well-individuated people, selves. But because they are whole, well-individuated selves, they themselves, by choice, right, through consent and conscious consent, or constitute a community, this particular kind of community. You can imagine that if you've got that kind of a feedback loop going, this is a enduring community, right? The people it produce it, but the people it produces do not become lesser by virtue of being part of it. Right? They don't lose their individuation. They don't become homogenous. They become increasingly singular, but they do not become atomized by virtue of their becoming singular. In fact, they become even more drawn to consensual community. Right? And so it's both maintains its integrity as a whole, but it also is evolving and expanding in the nature of what it is. Right? Its own interior continues to grow while maintaining its continuity as a whole. And that is another way of saying game B, right? That's the thing, right? That is the antidote. That is the move that that's on the other side of the devil's bargain. Right? It's the different kind of game that we can play. And so some interesting things about it that I've been noticing or discovering, or how does John talk about it? Imagio. That is this word that means both to discover and to invent simultaneously. Recently I think it's proper and certainly helpful to be thinking about this new game in a fashion that's somewhat simple, meaning that from one point of view, it's just a special case of culture in general. It's just a special case of the kind of games that we play. Yeah, can I drill down on that a little bit? And here I want to invoke another friend of mine, Greg Henricks, who I've been just speaking to recently, who has a model he calls TALK, the theory of knowledge. He uses all kinds of obviously Gen X acronyms to describe what he's doing. And so what he talks about in the theory of knowledge is he very specifically has a description of what's happening and why we see these moments of emergence. So the transition
moments of emergence in history or
in history. In history. So, and I'll provide more detail. So the movement from say physics to chemistry, from chemistry to biology, from to genetics and evolving organisms. In the context of biology, the emergence of behavior, intelligence, biological organisms that are doing things on the basis of, in fact, neurology, sensing. From behavior, then the emergence of culture, right? And then from culture, the emergence of this next thing. Right? So we actually find ourselves having conversations about, okay, what's this next thing? We're in culture. We can now describe what this thing is and where it comes from and how it sets up and what came before it and what these kind of transitions look like in general. What's this transition that we're at? What's it look like? And one of the interesting characteristics of it is that each of the transitions looks like a particular location on the previous landscape. And so neurology is just a kind of cell. You've got all these different kinds of cells and they all do different kinds of things. One of them is a neuron. From the point of view of like cellular, it's not that sexy. It just turns out that once you've discovered neuron, you may not have noticed it yet. You're now actually beginning to play a very different kind of thing, because you can begin to coordinate neurons into larger and larger structures. They have that characteristic that they can connect with each other and form neural pathways, and they can specialize. The different kinds of neurons can specialize in different ways. And now what happens is that neurons generate the possibility of different reactions, different regular reactions to discrete inputs. And that's what a neuron is, right? And like a photosensitive cell has the ability to distinguish between enough light to be able to say yes, no to light, and then drive different behaviors, right? And that's how behavior emerges. And behavior emerges as a consequence of the discovery of this particular thing, this particular kind of cell that has the characteristics of neuron. And then sociality, culture, emerges in the context of behavior. There's a whole bunch of stuff that happens in behavior space. Sorry, I think I got a little bit esoteric and maybe a little bit nerdy, but the point is that there's a way of properly looking at the transition that we're at, where you're going to look at the kind of culture that escapes or is the antidote. And in many ways, it's just going to look like a culture. I'm like, okay, got it. You know? Why is it special? Oh, okay. Well, we're going to know that the specialness is emergent. It's the emergence that it affords. And then, by the way, it's also the regularity that it affords, right? The stability that it affords.
You mean the human stability, like the stability in terms of taking care of people? You mean at a fundamental level?
Yeah, in some sense. Maybe be a bit more clear. And by clear, I actually mean literally inventing the answer to your question on the fly. What I mean is the simplification of the choice landscape such that the simplification is consistently chosen. That's not a very clear statement, is it? Let me say it again a different way. Well, I described it earlier with a slightly different form, which was like we have a kind of culture. I described it as a community. So we have a kind of community. And this community has a very interesting character, which is that it produces people who, and maybe if I zoom in on the stability, it produces people who are in fact well individuated. So they don't have to have an adolescent break. Right? They don't have to, in fact will not choose to try to destroy or break or fight against their culture. Instead, they will be able to they will find themselves supported in discovering the nature of their individuation by virtue. They'll be well held. Right? So care, right? This culture holds the developmental process elegantly so that we don't find ourselves fighting against and breaking and rebelling against. We don't need to. Rebelling is actually not a natural process. Rebelling is an unnatural but necessary reaction to something that is not supported well. And also, these well-individuated people will, like I said it earlier, they will choose. They will consistently, but choose. Right? Think about the really interesting characteristic there. They will consistently choose to recreate or to generate amongst themselves this particular kind of community. That is stable. Right? All the things that have historically caused our civilizations to fall apart, of which there are three exact kinds. There are three kinds of things that cause them to fall apart. All three are resolved.
Say the three really quickly.
Sure. So one has to do with the relationship between our civilization and nature.
Yeah.
Desertification. Right? We trade the long term for the short term until the long term comes to pass, and we're fucked. The second has to do with this hierarchy of domination. We have an interior, but in our interior, we are actually sowing the seeds of an inevitable conflict. There's always going to be the struggle to figure out who's on top. And as soon as a crack opens, war on the interior happens. And the third is the same thing on the exterior. The exterior is the relationship with the other on the outside. And if my, Rome, if I do not maintain my borders at a high enough level, and in maintaining my borders at a high enough level, I'm simultaneously generating resentment and antipathy on the other side of the border, and teaching them how to get better and better and better at playing the devil's game until eventually they burst, right? So either humiliated individuals on the interior destroy the civilization from its inside. And by the way, these humiliated individuals are not necessarily the lower class, right? The increasingly drug-addled and ennui-ridden and disconnected
President of the United States
are humiliated just in a very different fashion. Right? We'll call it debased. The debased and humiliated, just so we can kind of distinguish it, corrupt it or tear apart that from the interior. Or guys on the outside eventually figure out how to break through. Or worst case, or sort of last checksum, we've just destroyed the actual nature, and it collapses
and can't support it.
All three.
But for this culture to work and thrive, we're talking about a very high level of human development, a high level of self-awareness.
Oh yes.
We're talking about,
but not fictional, right? Not like, well, we're going to become just like these imaginary beings that don't actually ever exist, and then it'll be okay. It's more like, well, we'll actually get to a place where we're all roughly the same level of maturity and self-awareness and self-management as, say, the citizens of Tahiti before Cook landed. Or have you ever noticed a person who just was really very grounded and wise and seemed to be good at managing their lives without creating too much havoc in other people's lives? Like that. Most people, just like most people, will be more better. Like it's not, we don't have to get to a point where everybody's awesome or even perfect, but most people are more better. And then once you get past that tipping point, by the way, it happens again in the sense of sort of everywhere. So it happens at the level of the interior, so the human, or the interior of the human or the individual. So the human beings, the individual human beings, are healed, made more whole, but also in the relationships. And so the modes and means and mechanisms of how we're able to work together to support each other, to co-steward nature and to support the commonwealth are also healed, right? So different means and modes of relationship. And this can be, it's a lot. There's a lot of things to be talked about here, but let me just give an example of a very simple one. Just say conversation. You and I are having a conversation. In this conversation, there are in fact a very large number of implicit protocols that are guiding our conversation. For example, as far as I can tell, neither of us is either consciously or meaningfully unconsciously endeavoring to lie. Right? In fact, my basic sense is I'm simply striving to achieve a higher level of clarity in what it is that we're communicating. That's it. Like signal to noise ratio, maximize signal, minimize noise. It's sort of a very simple protocol. Now you might notice, however, that is not a protocol that actually governs the relationships of communication in many, in fact, one might even say almost all communications. If you take a look at the landscape that we find ourselves in, our social, our linguistic, communicative commons has been enormously degraded. The commitment to caring for that commons thoughtfully, noting that, for example, achieving higher levels of clarity is both process and result, has been ravaged over the past 50 to 75 years. I actually remember the moment as a child. I was probably like 4 or 5 when I discovered that I lived in a culture where it was not just appropriate, but apparently ubiquitous and obligatory to lie to children in a sophisticated way. It was in fact a McDonald's Happy Meal commercial. So I was watching this box that clearly had cultural support, meaning my parents put me in front of the box and turned it on. And in the box, there was music that caused my body to feel a felt sense of enthusiasm. Colors that made my visual sense feel a sense of enthusiasm. And it was bound to an object that was a bag full of food that was called a Happy Meal. And my semantic processor was like, happy. Yeah, that also maps. So I feel good. It looks good. It sounds good. It must be awesome.
Yeah.
So I cajole my parents, get me a Happy Meal, right? This culture is amazing, right? I go to McDonald's. So far, so good, by the way. Everything's yellow and plastic and, day glow. I'm not yet noticing that the plastic has a weird felt sense of already being dead. Like I didn't realize it was in a mausoleum just yet. I get the bag. It looks like the one on TV. So far, so good. I open it up. I take out the hamburger. I remember actually at that point having my first whiff of like, something's wrong here. I ate about a third of it. And I had a deep existential crisis as a 4-year-old. I am not happy. This thing does not even vaguely feel like the feeling that I associated with it in that television program. And all at once it dawned on me that I lived in a culture where it was permitted, obviously not at this level of linguistic complexity, but I remember the moment. Where it was permitted and in fact apparently obligatory and ubiquitous to lie to children effectively.
Wow.
How fucked up is that? Like, that's insane. It's not even borderline insane. It's completely insane. And yet, look around. All right. So the point is this. It's not actually that hard to not be completely fucking insane. We're not talking about a high bar. We're talking about not fucking it up. Right? Can we just not manipulate everyone maximally all the time? And in point of fact, once you stop doing that a little bit, it turns out it's actually a lot easier and more satisfying, and in fact more fun, and by the way more meaningful to even like almost never do that. To be careful and be actually mindful of the notion of like where white lies are the most careful thing you can do, right? and where the kind of the cold hard truth is where things need to be, right? If you could sit in that space, if you're like sitting most of the time in conversations where like, okay, how do I say the thing right now that's the most empowering version of this conversation? Noticing what can be held, what I can express with sort of adequate truthfulness and clarity and elegance, and what can be heard in the context of what the relationship can hold. Like if that's where you're at, then you're there. Like that's it. That's where we are. And then of course what happens is you get an upward spiral because every conversation of that sort simultaneously teaches more skillfulness in how to have those conversations, builds more capacity in each individual, and builds new insights into what even that means. So cool. Just take that and extend it against all the distinct characteristics of, for example, community. And there's not that many, maybe dozens or hundreds.
And do you see this organically happening in different places and different contexts?
Yes.
I see the desire for community, the desire to be in meaningful relationship with each other, with nature, etc., to be something that is actually very powerfully palpable in many parts of the culture and across the spectrum of political views or whatever.
So I would say yes, and I would say yes in a number of different ways. So yes, in the sense that what you're saying, the desire for community is in fact increasingly palpable. And not just the desire, but we're now in very much a renaissance. These things kind of come in pulses. So there's a big pulse that happened in the 60s, and that sort of evaporated. Now we're in a new pulse. So many, many, many 100, maybe even thousands X increase in people acting on that impulse. Because of course the context of say coronavirus and the economy have generated a little push out of the old nest. And there's some interesting characteristics there, because acting on an impulse, you get learning. We will once again learn a lot about this.
Mm-hmm.
That's one piece of it. Another piece is very, very narrowly focused, and therefore also more intensely and with more success in some sense on aspects of the problem. So, you and your husband have been focusing on certain characteristics of how groups of people come together and have a felt sense and a lived reality of wholeness, right? And you've moved the bar forward a lot, like from where things were before to where they are now, and the community of which you are part, and then the larger meta community of people who've been attracted to that practice who may not even know each other, even more so, right? It kind of percolates out and slice and dice, right? We have taken the notion of money, which, as I mentioned earlier, has been so itself intrinsically tied to the current mechanism of society. And over the past 15 years, we've smashed that. Cryptocurrency has moved money from being a fabric of reality over which humans have no choice, or almost all humans have no choice, to something that is, a design choice that we haven't yet figured out how to design well, but we design it, right? And that's a movement forward of that piece. Conversation, meditation, mindfulness, fill in the blank. So that's of that second category. This is more narrow band explorations where big chunks of advance have been made. We've discovered lots of it. And then the third is what I might call the embodied adjacent possible of everyone. And so everyone in their specificity is continuously exploring the adjacent possible. Now, with greater or lesser success. If your circumstances are very choppy, if your life is hard, then you may fail, and you may actually make things worse. In fact, quite often that's kind of the point of what happens when you get into a choppy situation. Or B, just the horizon that you can get to where you are may not be very far, right? So you may have grown up in a context where your developmental environment taught you a whole lot of bad habits and what parenting is like. And your generation is just going to be the generation that doesn't beat its kids a lot. Right? Well, but nonetheless, that's a big forward move, right?
Adjacent possible.
That's a big piece, right? And then your kids may in fact get all the way to the point of not beating their kids at all. And their kids may actually start nurturing, right? Consistently, right? I mean, that's the generational arc. Of course, that generational arc has been going on. We've been struggling with the kind of like the rippling echoes of that big bomb that hit us 35,000 years ago, and the echoing consequence of live or die and fight and humiliate and all the sort of noise put into the environment. But at the same time, everybody everywhere has always been trying to figure out how to upgrade in their local adjacent possible. Okay? And we've had a lot of success. Right? We are not the Romans. We're not the Sumerians. A whole lot not. So then you take all three of those, and you take the moment, where we are, and there's this collaboration. We engaging in our conversation, supported by the technique that we've individually generated, can bring the pieces that we have held, have learned, or have developed into relationship with each other. We live now, for example, in a communications medium, which is part of the same evolutionary arc, where we can have this conversation. So all the individuals and all the narrow band discoveries are now finding themselves in the context of this increasing urge, this impulse, diversified across a huge population to get to a new place. And the potential energy, right, the possibility of all these things integrated together is enough to cross over. Right? We could make it. We have the possibility. The only question is, do we thread the needle? It's kind of like the metaphor that popped into my head was something like, the moon's over there. I have a rocket. I have enough fuel. Right? I can definitely get to the moon. Now the question is, do I get to the moon? Am I pointed the right way? There's a big universe. If I'm pointing the wrong way, I'm just going to get to something moon far apart, but not the moon. And I think that's where I spend most of my time. Is like, okay, the trajectory that we are on is going to deliver a very large magnitude of change.
Mm-hmm.
That is yes, 100%.
Mm-hmm.
The likelihood that we were just kind of like 10 years from now will look a lot like 10 years ago is, from my point of view, actually zero.
Uh-huh.
Not real small, like actually zero.
Uh-huh.
But do we thread the needle?
Mm-hmm.
You know, it has been said that it is, getting a camel through the eye of the needle. Like, this is a tricky business.
Mm-hmm.
It's not going to be, the likelihood of success, properly speaking, should be considered very, very low.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, there's something about the nature of what we're doing where faith, and now I'm taking one of those shitty terms, right? Pulling out the pearl, dusting it off, is the way.
Mm-hmm.
Right? If we have faith, and again, I'm going to say it again, we've got to be really careful. Right? When I say that, I don't mean if we believe shit that ain't true really, really hard. What I mean is something very distinctly different than that. But if we have faith, then we will certainly thread the needle.
Uh-huh.
If we can discover what is meant by that, then we'll be in good shape.
I would just say that is a huge thing that you just said, if we have faith. Because if we can develop ways to be intelligent, for the driving force of creation to be something that we are able to, that is intelligible to us, then that which made these amazing bodies of ours, the biosphere, that which has always produced something that is in holism, that is emergent out of this niche or this interaction, that if we can tap into that which has created all of this and be agents of that, if you want, have our agency be driven by that, which takes an enormous amount of faith, an enormous amount of trust.
Well, what I would say is it doesn't take an enormous amount of faith. It is faith.
Yeah.
That thing is faith.
Uh-huh.
To become capable of becoming a conduit, becoming a vessel, becoming to be driven by or motivated by, to act on behalf of and through this creative force.
Yeah.
That skill, in some sense. It's almost like faith is almost like a skill. It's like becoming an artist. When someone like, say, a Beethoven has the Ninth Symphony flow through him, that is faith, right? When a Miles Davis, these great artists, that creative impulse is flowing through them with majesty, with grace, right? They've been graced by. That is faith, right? So that's the trick, is we have to simultaneously not get tripped up by the by the devil's bargain, right? By the profaning of the things, as we've been over the past 35,000 years, but then also to develop in ourselves the skillfulness, the capacity to do this thing. Then, as you say, it's already here. It's not like we will get there. It's already here if we are able to do that.
Yeah, I think that's where we end.
Sounds good.
Sounds meaningful.
Yeah. Well, I'm really glad that you and your husband reached out to me. I feel like this was a very nice conversation.
Yeah, I appreciate it. I appreciate speaking with you. Yeah, great. I think it'll make a really, really deep and interesting, I think it will twist people's heads in a good way.
Nice.
Conversation.
Right. Beautiful.
Yeah, for our magazine. Okay.
Tschüss.
Tschüss. Yeah. Thank you so much.